first, I wanted to say just how blown away I am about how all this turned out. It's been really great to have an intimate conversation with so many talented people with knowledge, not just about the technology, but also the different subsets and just bringing it all together. Especially want to thank Daria and Ramona here at the university to help put this on, Alex especially, Susanna, and Professor Katina Michael, of course. On the agenda it says drone journalism, and I will definitely speak to that. But really, my talk is more of the drones for good, essentially. I mean, it's, and so I'm going to get into the journalism part in a bit. But first, I'd like to talk about the coverage of drones specifically and the kind of challenges that this presents to the technology and adoption and et cetera. So this is the cover of Time Magazine's February edition, Rise of the Drones, featuring very prominently a aircraft known as the Predator, manufactured by General Atomics, above what is ostensibly a house somewhere in suburban America. And this is a problem for a number of reasons. One is that it's an illustration, it's a fabrication. This never happened. And that's especially a big problem when we're talking about a technology that people are not familiar with themselves because they see an image like this and they assume that it's the reality. It might be the reality somewhere else, and that's very important, but it's not the reality above suburban America, and it's not the reality that most people will have in dealing with the technology. Another part is just kind of accuracy with this. So this aircraft obviously is very low to the ground. It's actually flying well below its operational altitude. When these are used in a war zone, there are many hundreds and thousands of feet in the air when they launch munitions. In this case, it's armed with 2 Hellfire missiles. But the third problem with this, beyond that, is best illustrated if you do just a little mental exercise. So this is an F-16, fully armed. This is an aircraft that can carry more than 7,000 kilos of munitions anywhere in the world. There are more of these in the skies than there are Predators. The reality is when you take a pilot out of the situation, there are things that still stay the same. And the reality is that this buzzing a house is no more likely to happen than the Predator drone buzzing a house with a similar complement of armament. So when the public is introduced to this idea of how drones are used, obviously the reaction is very strong. And some of that reaction gets manifested into legislation such as this. This is a bill from the U.S. state of New Hampshire, HB 619. And it goes a little something like this. A person is guilty of a Class A misdemeanor if such person knowingly creates or assists in creating an image of the exterior of any residential dwelling in the state where such image is created by or with the assistance of satellite, drone, or any device that is not supported by the ground. This prohibition shall not apply where the image does not reveal forms identifiable as human beings or man-made objects. So if you used Google Maps to get here today, good luck with that. That would not be allowed under this bill. This is not the reality in all American states, though. New Hampshire is one of the few states that have pursued legislation that's extremely restrictive like this. Another state is Texas, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, and another state is Oregon. All these states have since either tabled legislation like this or have shifted their legislation and amended it to be more similar to other states which are adopting drone regulations, which primarily deal with police, and that police have to have a search warrant issued from a judge before they're allowed access to an aircraft. And it's more specific from a state-by-state basis. But it's just a sample of the kind of reactionary and and overreaching laws that can be created when there's a lot of fear in the public and not a lot of understanding about the potential for the technology. Another problem with the coverage is that we're using a term that may not be wholly accurate, and we may be applying it in an overly specific context. So here is essentially a crack at a definition of what a drone is from John Velasnor. He is an engineering professor at UCLA and also Brookings Institution fellow. And in his blog post, he specifies that it's an aircraft first and foremost. It must be able to fly beyond visual line of sight. So that means that the operator must be kind of divorced in a way from being able to see the aircraft. It also must not be flown under the control of a human operator, period. Must be able to fly autonomously with the aid of sensors, including GPS. The issue with a definition like this is that there already is a definition that has been written, and it actually dates back to 1946 and even earlier. So we all might be familiar with the first definition of a drone, which is a bee, specifically a male bee, a non-worker whose sole function is to make tiny baby bees with queen bee. So that dates back to about 1000 AD. Another definition cropped up in 1529, a non-worker or lazy idler. But the one we're here and most interested in is the third one, a pilotless aircraft or missile directed by remote control. It's important to note that the definition in Webster's differs from the Oxford English definition in that the provision for a missile is removed, so there's no mention of missile in the Webster's dictionary. But what they both have in common is that it's at least an aircraft and it's at least guided by remote control. In other words, there's not a pilot on board. So that is the dictionary definition of a drone, but it's not used usually in a military context or in an industry context. This is much more common with industry use is unmanned aircraft system, UAS. Another option is RPAS, remotely piloted aircraft system. But according to the FAA, it's the aircraft itself and all the associated support equipment, control stations, data links, yada yada. The unmanned aircraft itself is the flying portion of the system, and it's flown by a pilot via ground. Or it can be autonomous or semi-autonomous through the use of an onboard computer. But the drone has been around for about 120 years. And even though it wasn't called that then, the first instance of a drone can be traced back to a patent filed by Nikola Tesla in 1898. Method and apparatus for controlling a mechanism of moving vessels or vehicles. And he describes methods of and an apparatus for controlling from a distance the operation of propelling engines, steering apparatus, and other mechanisms carried by moving bodies or floating vessels. And this was the illustration he included with it, which if you're a Tesla fan, you'll know that it's controlled by alternating current and not DC current from batteries E and E. And it's a boat. And the first time he used this boat was at a World's Fair a couple years later. And keep in mind that at this point in time, most people did not have access to or may not have even heard sound coming from a radio in their own home. So this was before a lot of people even heard the concept of audio radio, and here they are and witnessing a craft that's moving by itself. So it mystified some people and it scared others. In this demonstration, Tesla would ask questions of the audience, many of them math related, and when he received a response, he would blink a light on the boat. And so, but the people didn't know how it did that, so they assumed that it was robotic in nature, that they assumed that there was some kind of brain on this boat that was making the lights flash, which just freaked them out even more. But as journalists do, and one happened to be there from the New York Times, asked Tesla, what about the military applications? And Tesla basically flipped out on him. Said, you do not see there a wireless torpedo, you see there the first of a race of robots, mechanical men which will do the laborious work of the human race. So even from the beginning, there seems to be a non-military purpose for this. And it's actually not until very recently that it's actually been weaponized. Even in the interwar period, 1931, this is where we actually see drone being applied to an aircraft. And it's generated from the Royal Air Force, actually. There were a number of aircraft called the Queen. It took not much a stretch of imagination to get it to fly itself and then call it a drone, a different kind of bee. But anyway, the original Queen, it was a seaplane. The drone had no autopilot, so it was all radio controlled, and it was meant to be a target drone. So from here on, you basically have a definition of a drone that is something that is being shot at, as opposed to something that is doing the shooting. Another instance is the de Havilland Queen Bee a few years later, top speed of 100 miles an hour, range of 300 miles, fairly successful with 380 built, retired after World War II, interestingly. In America, drones really came about because of DIY people, before there was a maker movement. So we have a gentleman named Reginald Denny, who was an actor, formerly of the Royal Flying Corps. He started a hobby shop in California in 1934 and started turning out toy airplanes and also at the same time radio planes, which were target drones for the Air Force, and very successful with 15,000 target drones produced during World War II. One of his employees was this woman. She worked 60 hours a week, $20 a week. Her name was Norma Jean. After this photo was taken for a magazine trying to improve troop morale during the war, she was basically found, changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. So to get to the answer of how these will probably be used in the future, and some of this is getting into Ian's conversation about drones for good. This is drones for money. This is where a lot of the development is going to happen, is where the money comes from. As you can see, big chunks of the pie for agriculture. It's actually the single biggest component, and probably the way that many people will become associated or think of drones in the future. Instead of jet aircraft used in warfare, instead think of primarily crop dusters. Other is a big component too, but it consists of a lot of these bullets on the left with wildfire mapping, disaster management, thermal, infrared power line surveys, telecommunication, weather monitoring, aerial imaging, television news coverage, so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, all those bullet points right now are being done currently. So there's nothing up on that list that isn't either being done in a commercial environment right now or being researched to be done in a commercial environment. Public safety actually is a very small portion of the budget for this, 89 million. That's not to say it's not important. Yesterday I had a question asked of me, how does that rate with military expenditures? And I couldn't find a direct correlation, but this is what I did find. The projected market for commercial applications in 2018, this is after 2015, when it is predicted that the FAA will come out with regulations thus allowing commercial aircraft, that market will be $13.6 billion. The military budget for fiscal year 13 includes $26 billion for the U.S. government. So this is the United States market. This isn't representative of all countries. But that does kind of illustrate also kind of where the money comes in a larger context. Ian mentioned this aircraft, which has been extremely useful. It's the Yamaha R-Max, and it's used for precision agriculture in the sense of precision crop dusting. Wildly successful in Japan. There's currently over 2,500 registered R-Maxes, and together they spray approximately 30% of all Japanese rice fields, so a huge number. But it also means more than just spraying for crops, even though that the R-Max allows farmers to distribute their pesticides in far smaller quantities. It's also about finding problem spots and reducing use of water and fertilizer and such. And here's the cover of Successful Farming magazine, basically looking at the future of of drones as precision agriculture. Studies are being done currently in the United States and abroad about how to go about doing this precision agriculture. So this is a journal, an article on PLOS ONE out of Spain about the configuration and specifications of an unmanned aircraft vehicle for early site-specific weed management. Basically, they had a quad-rotor aircraft survey a sunflower patch, a sunflower field, and used a variety of imaging equipment. They used RGB cameras and also multispectral imaging to generate these photos. And so, I mean, from them you can kind of pick out where the lines of the crops are, and therefore where the weeds might also be. And here they're trying to play around with the sort of optimal altitude to fly with both types of camera sets. Getting into other good uses, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they basically do the weather for the United States. But also a lot more. Here they are in Oregon, which is interestingly one of the states that has the strictest regulations, or was looking at the most restrictive regulations involving drones. Here, this aircraft is meant to take a look at seabird colonies, sea mammal colonies, etc. In Thailand, tremendous flooding in 2012. This is image from an aircraft that was used, contracted by the government. It was constructed by a person operating a small business who was contracted to inform the government on a daily basis about the flooding situation so that the government could allocate resources to the area. And it did end up saving a lot of property along the way. A use that many people may not have realized was in 2011 when the Fukushima disaster occurred, and the earthquake, the subsequent tsunami, and the nuclear meltdown occurred, that the United States actually deployed unmanned aircraft above the Fukushima disaster site. Primarily these large Global Hawks, which are unarmed, but they carry a number of cameras, and they specifically use the infrared camera to try to look at the condition of the reactor as it was melting down, and also understanding how radiation was spreading along the way. It flew 20 missions, some 300 flight hours. This was also a part of that. Much closer, this is a smaller Honeywell T-Hawk. It's about the size of a beer keg or a pony keg. A couple of these were lost along the way. But they got really close to the reactor in some very dangerous environments involving radiation exposure. The big issue with this was not that the government had deployed drones, but that the data that those drones had gathered was not public. The Japanese government cracked down on giving information to the public about the condition of the reactor and the spread of nuclear fallout and nuclear waste. To respond to that, a community grew out of Japan called SafeCast, and this is another element of the maker community that saw a need for data, and so they produced Arduino-based Geiger counters, distributed them around Japan, and then networked the data so that anyone around the country, around the world, could understand what is happening in their particular area. Interestingly enough, recently they announced they're attaching it to a drone so that they can now go into the areas, very similar to what the government had done with their own drones, but for the purpose of distributing it for the people. And I can't really overemphasize the importance of makers in all of this, because the drone revolution really is a ground-up revolution. On the left is the autopilot, the microcontroller that I use, that my students use when I teach them how to build drones as part of the National Science Foundation grant that I work for. It also powers that drone on the right. And this came out of the maker movement. So if you're familiar with Arduino, it's open source. You go online, you find the code, you find the schematics, you understand how it works, you find a community of people who've solved problems, you put it all together to solve your own problem. And it's all made possible by cheaper, smaller, faster processors, the interplay of ideas on the internet, and also the decreasing cost of the sensors and other components that help a drone see or fly. Ian mentioned the river of blood, and even though it was not a journalist who did this, it serves as an excellent case study of how a journalist might be able to go in a situation and do some really powerful investigative reporting. This is actually a picture of the aircraft. It's simply a radio-controlled airplane with a DSLR camera attached. And again, this was a person who didn't set out originally to do any, reporting on this, but yet the meatpacking plant that was dumping this into the river indeed was closed down, subject to federal fines. Also, the community next door who'd been living next to this mess for years and had complained about the stench, had no idea where it came from. Now their complaints are basically gone and their air is much, much cleaner. This person wasn't originally setting out to be a journalist and inadvertently became a journalist and decided to kind of run with it. So again, Istanbul, Taksim Gezi Park, a gentleman with a DJI Phantom decided that he wanted to record the park before it was destroyed by the authorities. And this person originally had no idea what was going on the ground until he actually came out there and saw police cracking down on generally well-respected individuals in the community, doctors, lawyers, university students. And the government at the time, and still today, runs with the line that this was instigators and terrorists, and et cetera. And so when he went out and saw this, he flew his DJI Phantom and took video and photo, got shot down, he found another one, and he's still flying today. So now that we're getting to some of the journalism uses, this is the flip side of the coin. This is when drone journalism goes bad. So this happened 2 days ago outside of Nelson Mandela's hospital. A journalist decided to fly a unmanned aircraft above all the people gathered outside that hospital. There was no lack of coverage at the time. But he decided he needed to do it anyway. The police waited until this gentleman retrieved his aircraft, took him inside the hospital, and had a strong word with him. I don't know, is he in here? Yes. Oh, would that be a good or bad thing to do, to fly an aircraft like that above a bunch of people outside of a hospital?
Well, it's an interesting point because you saw the guy in Westminster Square was flying his helicopter also above people, right? So
yeah.
It certainly would go against all the regulations, but as we talked about, journalists sometimes need to break regulations. I think the point is that it's probably less important to get that shot than it was at Tesla. So.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean,
Was that a real journalist?
Yes, professional.
It's gotta tell you something.
Which brings me to the ethics part of the conversation. When I started dronejournalism.org back in 2011, I realized there was a need to kind of make some meaning out of chaos, or try to minimize the damage that this disruptive technology could do. And I thought that if we had some rules to follow, that it would legitimize what we were doing as journalists, and it would allow us to have some latitude with the public in the sense that that they would allow us to operate because we were giving them information that would be of much use to them. And to make sure that this sort of contract stayed beneficial for both parties, I thought it would be great to start a code of ethics for people who wanted to use drones in journalism. And the idea is not to just produce something and then and just unleash it, but actually to make this a collaborative project. So on dronejournalism.org right now, there's a way to make this into a wiki. It's very cumbersome. Google Pages is not optimal for this sort of thing. And so right now I'm working on it with what time I have available to the project. But in the meantime, I thought it'd be a good idea just to publish some ideas on what ethics might look like for drone journalists. And I didn't see any reason to do away with the current kind of ethical considerations that journalism has, but just add to them, as the technology requires. So one of the big things that I have at the base, and this is a hierarchy, so it gives some kind of like direction as to how to operate. It's not just a list of rules that you have to memorize, but it's rather a process that a journalist can go through mentally. And basically, the minimum requirement is it newsworthy? There's an element of risk anytime you're flying an object above people. So the event that you're covering has to be worthy of that kind of element of danger. So after a journalist may have decided that this is very important, I wouldn't necessarily think that the helicopter, the drone over Nelson Mandela's hospital would qualify, considering how many people were there and kind of there wasn't as much need when there were so many journalists there in the first place, and that an aerial view would not actually provide that much more to the situation, might actually hurt it. And so that also leads into safety. Do I know how to operate the aircraft? Am I competent? Are the conditions optimal? Am I trained? Next, we go up into sanctity of law in public spaces. So am I violating any law? Sometimes journalists might have to find themselves compromising an unjust law to do some reporting, but that doesn't mean that it's not important to consider the law in the first place. And the expectation that people have in public spaces, privacy is the concern after that. Is this thing occurring in public spaces? Do I have consent from the people that I'm filming? And at the top, after you've done all those things, it's a good idea to go back and see if what you're doing originally is conflicting with any sort of standards of practice that otherwise as a journalist you'd be considering. But most of what I do beyond dronejournalism.org is actually going into the classrooms, bringing this technology to students. And we rely on maker technology. We rely on DIY drones to generate interest in engineering and STEM education. So the grant that I work for, we every summer train teachers throughout the state of Illinois in how to work with each other, start collaborations, and start innovations in schools that span classrooms and districts and really produce a lot of excellent learning opportunities for students. This is just one of the 32 or more that we've documented of those collaborations. This is the one that I'm most intimate with. And so here is basically photos from high school students ranging from 14 through 18. And they're going through the paces of learning how to pull all this together to get data from their aircraft. So we have field of view calculations on the upper left. We have training flights on the upper right with hobbyists in the community who we've formed collaborations with. The aircraft is a little bit different than the one on the lower left, but it's the same model, same basic idea. And fortunately, we do have some interest from having girls join and having representation from women in the program, and we're trying to increase that with every kind of iteration that we do with this. This is one example of a product that has come out of the collaboration. This is data that's obtained from the aircraft. It's basically it's simple flight data to let us know if the aircraft is behaving the way we intended it to. This is another example of data that we have obtained from our flight recorders of an actual flight happening. But this is what we're most interested in. This is an aerial mosaic of the ground that we actually use to fly. It's not perfect, but the idea is that if you fly in the correct pattern, in the correct manner, and take photos and record the GPS location of the photos, you can stitch them together, and there are numerous services on the cloud that you can send your pictures to, and you'll get a 3D dimensional model of the ground. at the end of the day, and that can be immensely useful for journalism, but also for environmental research. The last thing I wanted to talk about is how this all plays into kind of the future of the smart city. And we're most familiar with the smart city in the sense of sensors that might be embedded, in the city in fixed locations, or sometimes the sensors that you would have in your pocket with your cell phone. This is an illustration from the Wire magazine to try to imagine how all this ties together. A taxi gets automatic directions based on passenger schedules. A smartphone warns you of an ex-girlfriend ahead, and all this other stuff. But drones can be part of this because, as we discussed, drones are just basically a platform for sensors. They can only be a platform for packages. And it's been discussed here about MatterNet, which is a project to bring medical supplies to underserved regions in Africa where the roads may just not be passable. But this can also be applied in cities as well. I mean, we've seen Eden showed us the pizza delivery mechanism, and there's also been demonstrations with coffee and burritos and tacos. I think we're all done with the Mexican cuisine and the Italian cuisine. I think we need to focus on burgers and fries and that sort of stuff. But the point is that drones are reactive. They can arrive on a scene the minute that something happens, and you don't have to rely on something being embedded for something to come around and to happen. But kind of bringing it around full circle, we won't really realize all the applications that we can do with the drones if we adopt the laws that New Hampshire and Oregon and Texas have tried to do. But with that, I'll take questions. Thank you.